all this attempt during this spring, summer, and now autumn to take territory, they're going to run out of time this winter, and it's going to be more difficult to have an offensive. So when you get to next spring, where is their economic situation? Their GDP has leveled off. There's almost no growth in GDP. They have surges in inflation, which have taken place because they've overheated the economy. They're at a point now where they either have to decrease their interest rates, which risk fueling more inflation, or they keep the interest rates high and you risk recession. Now, the government budget deficit is increasing. It's up 30% in recent months. Can they keep throwing money at this invasion? Can they keep throwing resources at this invasion? And so what you have is you have a twin situation with, as I say, that 6 to 12 month window. What capacity does Russia have going into, let us say, the summer and autumn of 2026? And on the other hand, can Ukraine continue to get assistance from its allies to maintain its defense? And that assistance, by the way, we have to emphasize, is not just military aid, although that's important, but that's also economic and financial aid to keep Ukraine's government running, to keep its public services running. And I'm going to come back to a fundamental, because I think a lot of people forget this. If I was going to choose one economic situation to be in as Russia tries to maintain this invasion, would I rather be in a Russia which is largely isolated internationally, which faces a great deal of sanctions, which is heavily dependent on Iran and on China to buy its oil? Or would I rather be part of a Ukraine which is also allied with a European bloc, which actually is one of the world's largest economies, certainly has the largest population at 450 million? Would I rather be allied with a Ukraine which also can count on countries like Canada, Australia, South Korea, and Japan to provide assistance? Whose economic power would I rather have right now, Moscow or Kyiv, backed by international partners? I'm going to take the latter.
Does it mean that Ukrainian alliance with Western powers, Ukraine has more cards with these economies which support Ukraine rather than Russia and Russia's allies?
I think it comes down to Europe. I mean, although I don't want to underestimate other allies from Asia, allies from other parts of the world. The Canadians, for example, their Prime Minister, Mark Carney, just visited this week, and they pledged more military and economic aid. You know, we know that Europe is right there on the doorstep. We know that Europe both has put in the largest share of aid to Ukraine, much larger than the U.S. has, despite what Donald Trump says. And we know that Europe is leading the way in terms of sanctions on Russia at this point, with the 19th package coming soon. There are a couple of what we might call flies in the ointment, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Robert Fico in Slovakia, that has delayed the attempt by Europe to completely cut Russian energy supplies. Now, I think that will be key going forward. But if the European Union and individual European members stay firm behind Ukraine, yeah, I think that's essential. And I'll tell you another reason why it's essential. As much as we look at Donald Trump, and as he tries to steal headlines each and every day, European officials are working with those people you won't hear about in the headlines on a day-to-day basis. There's the envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg. There are people in the State Department, in the Pentagon, in the CIA. And as I speak to you right now, European officials and Ukrainian officials have apparently gotten those U.S. officials to agree to plan for a security guarantee. That security guarantee, as being reported in the Financial Times, who I value as a source, now means that for the first time, the U.S. is saying we will provide intelligence, we will provide air defense assets, we will provide other air defense capability to establish a no-fly zone, we will provide logistics, engineering to support a peacekeeping force when the invasion is halted. Now, if you think where we were with Trump 6 months ago, where there was no aid to Ukraine, Europe working with Ukraine has been vital to move the U.S. beyond what Donald Trump says in his latest, thought bubble.
From your perspective, what was the most crucial point made by European allies after which Trump changed his mind and agreed to provide a kind of security guarantees?
Well, again, I'm going to reinforce the point. The important thing that has happened all the way back to February is not what was said to Donald Trump. It was that they kept the channels open to the U.S. officials who are the adults in the room, right? Because Trump can flip from week to week. You have to have that planning going on a sustained basis. But if you want to talk about the most important thing between Donald Trump with Vladimir Putin in Alaska, where Putin is manipulating Trump. That was a week ago last Friday. And then 72 hours later, when Zelensky and the Europeans are in Washington talking to Trump, I think maybe there were two things that I think were symbolic moments. I think one symbolic moment was when Vladimir Zelensky handed Donald Trump the letter from Olena Zelenska to be given to Melania Trump. Now, that was a letter which said, think about the Ukrainian children who have been abducted, kidnapped, forced to live in Russian-occupied territory or Russia. Think about, conservatively, the 20,000 that have been documented, but up to 300,000 that may have been taken. That established a personal connection, which is really important because Donald Trump doesn't act on the basis of facts. He doesn't act on the basis of a knowledge of what is happening in Ukraine and Russia. He acts in terms of what he feels. Quite often, what is in it for me, Donald Trump, but sometimes, what do I see? And what Melania Trump has been telling Donald Trump is that Vladimir Putin doesn't stop, that he keeps attacking, he doesn't cease fire. He in effect makes Trump look weak. Trump hates that. So that letter from Zelensky is important. And then the second thing was in the meeting with the Europeans and Zelensky after that, when the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, told the table, he said, look, if you give up the rest of the Donetsk region to Russia, the 25% that Ukraine controls, if you let Russia have that Donetsk region, they're not going to leave. They're going to take that, and they're going to use that as a highway to Kyiv. And those were Stubb's words, highway to Kyiv. In other words, you have the perpetual threat of another Russian invasion. And I think that was what emphasized to Trump, first of all, you can't give away Ukrainian territory. And secondly, you really need to be thinking about security guarantees. Now, again, just over a week has passed, and Trump has had other, he's gotten angry about things, he's gotten frustrated about things, and he lashes out. But the fundamental is that after that meeting in Washington, Zelensky, the Europeans, then you had the planning which started between the Ukrainian, European, and American militaries, led by the American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So if Trump does flip-flop and go on, unless he actually orders a halt to that planning, that's the process that we're looking at to develop week on week and month on month. I will add one other thing for your viewers, by the way. Beyond the threat of Trump being chaotic, the other threat is within the Pentagon. The other threat is a man that you may never have heard of, named Elbridge Colby. Elbridge Colby is effectively at the level of almost like an assistant secretary of defense. He hates giving aid to Ukraine. He absolutely hates it. And a few weeks ago, you may remember that he did a review of U.S. military stocks, which led the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, who's not qualified, to suspend aid to Ukraine for a few days. That's it. We're cutting it off. We can't afford to give them anything. Now, that decision was reversed because the American military, the American officials said, you can't do that. You have that wild card that an official like Colby in the Pentagon could all of a sudden try to say, amidst all this planning I'm talking about, we have to stop it. We have to cut it all off. So I don't want to say this is a guaranteed process, but if you compare again where we were back in January, where we thought that was it, the U.S. was gone for good, and where we are, where we do have discussion of security guarantees and U.S. assistance, that is a big step forward It's not as far as we need to go, but it's a big step forward from where we were at the start of 2025.
Has Vladimir Putin lost US President Trump after these meetings in the White House between European allies, Ukrainian President Zelensky and US administration?
You never completely lose Trump because Trump, he's like, he's like a weather vane that spins in the wind. And like, who blows on the weather vane? And, the Kremlin could try to blow on it again. You are wonderful, Donald Trump. You should get the Nobel Peace Prize. You are a man who is just a great leader alongside our leader, Vladimir Putin. But there's a problem here. How far can the Kremlin go? I mean, in a way, I think they played their last big card, which is here's your face-to-face meeting with Putin, which is what Trump had wanted for months. Here you go. And you get to have the red carpet. You get to have Putin talk about how great you are in front of the US cameras. Now what can you give him? You can't go back to just a phone call from Putin and have the same effect. And secondly, Russia does not stop attacking Ukraine's civilians. And you cannot offer Trump that prospect of a Nobel Peace Prize and the prospect of being the big man in the world if you do not stop your attacks. You can't, because there's no peace. And the one thing I've never understood about the Russians, and maybe your great viewers can help me out. I think I know the answer, but it'd be interesting what your viewer says. That every time after we have a moment like this, where either it's Trump being flattered by Putin, or it was the Ukraine-Russia talks in Istanbul a few months ago, the day after the talks, Russia launches at least scores of drones and missiles, sometimes hundreds of drones and missiles. So last week, immediately after Zelensky and the Europeans met with Trump, I think it was the very next day that Russia fired more than 300 drones and missiles. You would think Russia would just stop for a few days. Now, as I speak to you right now, over the past couple of days, Russia has only fired about 70 to 80 drones on a nightly basis. They still cause damage. They still kill people. But it's not it's sort of a decrease on their rate of fire, but they need to stop it completely. That's the way they get Trump onto their side. But I don't think Putin will stop because, and I'll ask your viewers again to comment on this, Putin still thinks he can break Ukraine. He still thinks he can break Ukraine's civilians and break their energy supplies. And so he has this competition. Do I give up on trying to break Ukraine's civilians to win Trump over? Or do I keep attacking civilians and risk losing Trump?
But don't you think that it could be beneficial for the Russian side to try to reach a peace deal over Ukraine right now? With Donald Trump in the White House fully supports Vladimir Putin, likes Vladimir Putin.
Russia doesn't want a peace deal. I mean, the answer to this is easy. Russia wants Ukraine's surrender. So, and don't ask me, ask Sergei Lavrov, who said this every day last week. And that is that horrible phrase, the root causes of the conflict. You know what that means in Ukraine. You know that means that you give up all of Donbass, you give up parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia, you give up Crimea for good. Even if it's not legally recognized, Russia is in those territories. It means that Ukraine is kept weak and demilitarized. Not only do you not go into NATO, you don't get security guarantees from NATO members. It means that your path to the European Union is put into question. They may not veto it, but they'll try to say that we don't want this. It means all sanctions lifted on Russia. And it means we don't recognize Vladimir Zelensky as the legitimate president of Ukraine. That's what Russia's demanding. So there's no peace deal here. The question here is whether Trump supports Russia's ultimatum against Ukraine. And I think we're in this loop. Again, if I was to put a guess on how this ends, I think this ends next year, not with a peace deal. It ends with sort of a freezing of the lines. Russia occupies the areas that it holds right now. Ukraine maintains the rest of its territory, but Ukraine has a path to cooperation with members of NATO, not into NATO itself, but cooperation with NATO members, and it has a path into the European Union.
Does it mean that Vladimir Putin would agree to the ceasefire on the current front lines next year?
I don't think it's a question of Putin agreeing. I think it's a question of what it is. And I think that if Russia finally hits the wall in terms of how much territory it can take, and if you have the Europeans in particular, but then also some American input into it and other countries saying, we are going to protect Ukraine's territory. We are going to provide some personnel inside Ukraine, especially in the West where you are, to protect Ukraine's facilities, its drone manufacturing facilities, defense production facilities. We are going to protect European businesses who are in Ukraine. And you know that more European manufacturers, including defense firms, are going in. We are going to provide air defense for Ukraine. I think for 42 months, Vladimir Putin has put the ultimatum to Ukraine. You accept this or else. You have to reverse the terms of this. You have to make Ukraine strong enough where you put the terms to Putin, which is, you have to stop now. You have to stop now, because if you keep going, it is just going to get worse for you.
I would like also to cover one interesting moment which went viral with J.D. Vance answering the question about negotiations. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance says that every major conflict, even the Second World War, has been concluded by negotiating settlement, by negotiations. With this negotiations, do you see this as another humiliation for also humiliation and big blow to sacrifice made by the U.S. soldiers during the Second World War and other conflicts which were concluded by military power but not negotiations?
I'm not sure it was taken that way by Americans, but certainly people who circulated that clip, it went viral, said, look, either J.D. Vance is a liar or he's not very smart. Because you know in Ukraine, I know here, everybody who's read up on World War II knows it ended in unconditional surrender. It was the unconditional surrender of the Germans after their leader, Adolf Hitler, committed suicide rather than facing final defeat. And it was the unconditional surrender of Japan in Asia. That is what happened. So the important thing here is well, why would J.D. Vance say that? Because I don't think J.D. Vance is an unintelligent man. I don't think he's stupid. I think he knows there was unconditional surrender. J.D. Vance was putting out a message to an American audience, which is, that we're not going to put too much pressure on Russia. At least I don't want too much pressure to be put on Russia. In other words, the priority here are negotiations, which in some ways give space for Russia to continue their attacks, right? Because what we're talking about is, what does that mean that negotiations have to continue? What it means at this point is that J.D. Vance does not favor increased sanctions on Russia. What it means is that J.D. Vance favors a limitation of aid to Ukraine. What it means is that J.D. Vance favors a ban on Ukraine's long-range strikes inside Russia, at least using American missiles. So J.D. Vance is part of that camp that wants to restrict Ukraine. That's what that statement means. And the question here is does his camp, those who want to restrict Ukraine and its ability to defend itself, do they prevail? Or is it those in the Trump administration who favor Ukraine getting the security guarantees and possibly even getting more latitude to carry out the attacks inside Russia, to bring Putin to the table, not to present ultimata, but to actually have to make concessions?
Thank you, Professor Lucas, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to Ukraine. Thanks to you and your great viewers.